Happy New Year everybody, welcome back to Goldmark TV. Let's hope that 2021 is an easier year for us all than the last we've just had. We've got two very special things to show you today. Later on, Mike is going to have a look at a book by Rigby on local Leicestershire, local to us here in Uppingham and Rutland. It's a book that we are very familiar with Graham's output as a bookmaker and illustrator. So it's nice to have an old friend back in the gallery here. I'm going to take a very quick look at this fantastic John Piper print. I hope you enjoy. I've got this wonderful early lithograph by John Piper here. This is the second panel from his Nursery Frieze. Over the Christmas period, I was putting up a school print in my kids' room. It was a Christmas present from my mum for her grandchildren, my kids. And looking at some of these fantastic pieces, it got me thinking about some of the wonderful children's art made for children that was produced around this time in the sort of pre and post World War II period. Lots of fantastic ventures around that time that have sort of been lost to art history and been rediscovered over the years. This was made for Contemporary Lithographs Limited in the mid-1930s. Now this was a new venture, one of the very earliest from this time period, that sought to sort of bring the world of art out of fusty museums and art galleries and into real people's lives. It was a venture dreamed up by Robert Wellington, who was an ex-manager at Zwemmer's gallery. This was a famous bookshop and gallery in London in the mid-1930s. And he was good friends with John Piper. And it's not quite sure exactly where the idea for the venture came from, but much like the school print series that came later, the basic premise behind Contemporary Lithographs Limited was to make original lithographs and sell them to schools so that children could enjoy them in the environment of this classroom. Now, in all but the art that it produced, the fantastic prints that resulted from it, Contemporary Lithographs was a resounding failure, a complete commercial failure. It sort of was one of those sorts of projects that seemed to rest on the goodwill of friends. There was a huge number of acquaintances who all sort of lent their hands to this project. Piper and Wellington together commissioned a number of artists to come and produce lithographs for the series. And really it was John Piper's role as someone who knew an awful lot about printmaking, knew the ins and outs of that industry, to sort of shepherd the artists to Cohen Press. That was the very famous lithographers who produced these prints. He was the sort of the hand holder, and he actually helped a number of the artists with their own lithographs. They decided that they would make autolithographs. So lithography is a printmaking process where you draw directly onto a stone block, and that image is then printed from that block, that printing matrix. Autolithography simply means that the artists themselves were drawing directly on that block. It was as close as they could get to an original work of art. Piper actually hadn't made any lithographs prior to Contemporary Lithographs Limited. He was new to the medium, but he had a really good mind for graphic mediums, and he took to it very quickly. So he ended up supporting a number of the other artists who didn't come to it quite so easily. Piper and Wellington both made very clear to the artists that were producing the prints that they wanted them to stick to their styles that they were known for. They didn't want anybody to sort of pander to the children. They wanted real contemporary art for these pieces. Now, some of the artists didn't quite follow that brief, but Piper wasn't one of them. His was one of the most technically and visually dexterous in the series. And that's what we're seeing here in this second panel from the Nursery Frieze. The pair of prints that Piper produced for this second series, there were two sets of prints that were commissioned for the Contemporary Lithographs Limited, were these Nursery Friezes, and this is the second panel. They were actually so big in their design that they couldn't be printed at Cohen Press with Harold Cohen, who was the very famous lithographer, probably the preeminent lithographer of his time. So instead, Piper was shipped off to another printmakers down the road. He was stuck in a cobwebbed warehouse upper room working on this printer himself to fit these large plates in the presses that they had there. What's wonderful about this print is the energy to it, this fantastic mixture of different styles that we've got going on here. And actually, what you can see in this wonderful print is the breadth of the themes that John Piper was actually working on at the time. He was in a difficult period in his artistic life, trying to work out these two struggles in his head between the draws of abstract art and the avant-garde, and a sort of more pictorial, decorative style. And you can see that in this lovely print. You can see all the hallmarks of what he was working on at the time. There's this wonderful little pier here with these breakwaters coming from this pink seaside beach into this beautiful maritime blue. This is sort of reminiscent of the scenes of Brighton that Piper would have been working on at exactly the same time. And up here in the sky, these wonderful abstract clouds, these scratchy marks that go across the sky here, they're very reminiscent of the abstract collages of beaches that Piper was making, actually making their in situ, sitting on a beach, arranging papers as he looked at the sea out in front of him. What I really love about this print was that John Piper was not afraid of presenting children with a complex image. He knew that children loved and could really understand and appreciate the details in this sort of mixture of styles, that they had that complexity to them. They could read these different visual symbols and see the different things going on. You can see that struggle between John Piper, the provincial Englishman who liked going out and drawing brick walls and churches, and John Piper at the forefront of British avant-gardism. You can see that in this print. This lovely train just chuffing along here from this seaside resort. Compare this beautiful scene in this big topographical house, the sort of mansions that John Piper would paint later in his career. Compare those with this wonderful scene of a sort of beachside, a coastal a fire, a bonfire. These fantastic fireworks, these firecrackers that split and explode and burst, that almost look like flowers in a vase. And these fantastic little stick men. It's like a little prehistoric scene. Wonderful, sort of brutish, these crudely cut trees, totally contrasting with some of the styles elsewhere. These fantastic panels of colour. This is a print that's as much about printmaking, about the layers and the colours, about working in that kind of exploratory, progressive way, as much as it is a lovely, beautiful encapsulation of what British coastal resorts are like. Although Robert Wellington was a fantastic ex-manager, he had that managerial spirit, and although Piper was a fantastic printmaker, had wonderful knowledge and expertise within the print industry, neither of them brought any economic rigour to this project whatsoever. And you can well imagine them turning up and talking to supplies officers at schools, trying to sell these prints and being met with the sort of shoestring budgets that schools were running on then, being turned away a number of times. They actually, realising that they couldn't sell these prints to schools, they tried to try and get rid of this huge amount of excess stock and tried to sell them to the public. The British public didn't oblige them, but the German bombers of World War II did. And in 1941, when the premises of Contemporary Lithographs Limited were hit during the Blitz, the first panel from the Nursery Frieze, a large amount of stock of it left there in the offices, was burnt to a crisp along with a number of other prints that were there. This is the second panel, and it's very, very rare. They were sold often unframed. It was sort of expected that they might be pinned or pasted up in people's rooms, in school classrooms. Rarer still for this print, which was printed without a signature. Someone who obviously bought this went and found John Piper and got him to write his signature in the corner. This is, I think, a really fantastic piece, one of the very earliest lithographs that John Piper made, and I think one of his liveliest. I was thinking about it while I was putting up that school print in my kids' room, about how brave, how courageous a lot of the art that we made for children then, and how that spirit has sort of continued in our illustrators today. I think it's a really fantastic piece, and it'll grace anybody's bedroom wall.
I can hardly believe that it is now 5 years since Rigby Graham died. In 2015, we had a celebration. This was the catalogue that we did at the time. And I'm reminded in here there was obituaries in many of the leading national papers. And I'm reminded of this from the Times, irascible painter whose idiosyncratic landscapes are among the 20th century's best. Previous to our working with Rig, and I worked with him for 30 odd years, and in fact the first major show in the gallery was of his work. He had worked with Bill Gadsby in the Gadsby Gallery in Leicester, and perhaps the most important thing which they'd done together, a collaboration, was the giant Leicestershire book. And I'm going to talk about this now because we've just managed to buy this one back. It's just arrived from America. There were 150 of these things, and it was suggested originally, I think by Bill Gadsby, to Rig on a walk they were doing together, that it was the 150th anniversary, or about to be the 150th anniversary of the great topographical book of Flowers, Leicestershire. And wouldn't it be nice to do something modern? Would Rig like to do it? And he said yes, and in fact I think he worked for 4 years on this book, and in 1980 Gadsby actually published it. It was an extraordinary feat. Graham designed this book. He wrote something like 60-odd thousand words for it. Well, I think it was 66,000 words. He says somewhere in here that the words were actually just to keep the pictures apart. He made countless paintings for this. The book is also full of original lithographs, and the end papers, colour line blocks. It's a method rarely used. Minton used it, and his great book Time Was Away. And there is absolutely fantastic end paper of Cliff Hill Quarry, which was a colour line block. Rigby Graham wrote these 66,000 words by hand. Some of it was dictated to his long-suffering and lovely wife Pat. But I want to read you a little bit from the book, and you'll get an idea of what the man was about. He writes here, "This is a picture book to which have been added some notes, more for keeping the pictures apart than by way of explanation. Over the past 4 years, during which time I have worked intermittently on this, those people who have known have asked me repeatedly, had I read this or seen that? Their references, without exception, were always directed towards the historical. Nothing I could do or say protected me from their infuriatingly predictable comments. Though kindly meant, I found it a source of irritation that people would assume that any text I wrote would be merely a rehash of what others had written. To those who search for history, they will not find it here. They should look to Throsby, Ellis, me, Hoskins, Pevsner, more recently Brian Bailey, or the numerous guides and local histories. Most of these are splendid books, and I have no wish to try to emulate them, nor merely to absorb and regurgitate what these authors have written. It's the pictures which speak for themselves. To those who care quietly to listen in much the same way that Leicestershire has spoken to me. These are my recollections of and reactions to what I have seen and heard. The landscape speaks clearly and distinctly, if quietly, and reveals an incredible amount about what has gone, what is happening now, and indicates much of what is likely to come. The book was printed by Trevor Hickman at the Brewhouse Press in an edition of 150 copies only. The production costs of this book were enormous, somewhere between, I think, 50 and 60,000 pounds, and it's to Bill Gadsby's credit that he stuck with it, as between them Graham and Hickman came up with more and more ideas for it. The book got bigger and bigger, and I think Gadsby almost went bust making this. But what was achieved was perhaps one of the greatest 20th century topographical books, a book to rival all the great topographicals of the early 19th century. We've got a copy just come in from America, which we're putting up for sale.
The problem is not ideas. Ideas are 10 a penny out there. You know, as everyone says, there are only like 5 stories in the world. You know, you just got to pick one and do something different with it. What you need is a kind of mental acuity and sufficient energy. But for me, perhaps the most important thing is a sense of necessity. Something needs to be written. You have to think to yourself, I am confident that this story needs to be told. The world needs this storytelling. And if you haven't got that sense of meaningful purpose, I think it's really hard to write.